So does the UK need a First Amendment? I think it's clear to almost anyone that we can't go on like we have been. I know a lot of people were shocked by the censorious, authoritarian turn the government took in the summer in the wake of those despicable race riots, where we saw the Director of Public Prosecutions taking to the airwaves to say that even retweeting something hateful could land you in prison, when we saw government Twitter accounts foghorning the words "think before you post" and basically trying to put the wind up anyone who would dare utter a dissenting thought. I think we saw in that particular moment very clearly that we're in this country, but not exclusively, lumbered with a ruling class who seem to see all of society's problems, be they racism or violent disorder, as basically downstream from an excess of freedom of speech. They genuinely seem to think, Keir Starmer genuinely seems to think, that if Elon Musk didn't let a handful of hard-right agitators back onto X 6 months ago, none of that stuff in the summer would ever have happened. That's a really very simplistic way of looking at things. I think it's also a very anti-human way of looking at things, but that, unfortunately, is how they look at it. And one of the things that I think is came abundantly clear in that moment is it was a reminder and an articulation, in a sense, of what the First Amendment is designed to do. It's to protect ordinary people's speech rights from moments of state authoritarianism or these kind of periodic flashes of official hysteria which take place from time to time. But I think that before we start talking about some kind of new constitutional settlement for the United Kingdom, really this is to put the cart before the horse. There's a prior problem that we need to address, which is precisely the culture of freedom of speech, the agitation towards securing our liberties, which needs to be sorted out first. There's a hell of a lot more work to be done. So the thing is, I think in the summer, that came as a shock to a lot of people, but really it shouldn't have been a surprise. I mean, the UK has been, it's almost the opposite story to what Nico was laying out there. We've been engaged in a long-running, decades-long experiment with policing hate and offence. It began in roughly 1965 with the Race Relations Act, but we've tumbled a fair way down the slippery slope since then. If you ask your average gender-critical feminist or even Christian street preacher, you no longer have to be some kind of far-right bigot to have your collar felt by the police these days. And it comes down to this problem, is that there is this culture amongst our ruling class which essentially sees censorship as all that stands between civilization and barbarism. What we really need to focus our efforts on is dislodging that ideology. And I think that if we want to push back against this censorship, as well as secure our rights in the long term, and we could discuss about the best way to do that, that is the prior thing that confronts us. Because, as Nico was laying out there, the First Amendment, first of all, has it not necessarily actually been protecting people's rights for most of its existence? It also didn't fall out of the sky. I mean, when the First Amendment was actually written, when it was debated, when that amendment was actually passed, it was the product, even then, of years of agitation amongst the American revolutionary generation, as they were agitating against British rule. They were under the yoke of Britain, they were subject to the various seditious libel laws, but they decided to defy them. They wrote pamphlets, they wrote broadsides, they burnt giant effigies of the king and the tax collectors and so on. And one of the fascinating things about this is even when these individuals were hauled up before courts for seditious libel and so on, jurors would refuse to convict them. Such was the strength of feeling for their rights and for their liberties at that particular point. So they seized freedom. It wasn't something that was handed down to them. Now, I'm not saying that we should all now go over to Parliament Square and burn a giant effigy of Keir Starmer.
No one is to clip this.
So that would be. What I am saying is that we should all focus on developing that culture of deepening the argument for freedom of speech, campaigning, persuading. I think a big part of it is seizing the moral high ground from these supposedly kindly censors who claim to wield this authoritarianism with the best of intentions. Otherwise, we haven't got a hope in hell of securing freedom of speech in the long term, overturning the rules that we have, let alone talking about some kind of longer-term settlement for the future. And I think it's important to note, as Nico has already gestured to, is that even if you had a First Amendment in this country, that's not the way that you can secure it in the long term. You need that culture of agitation, you need that strident defence of freedom of speech from the bottom up if you're going to end up with a politics, with citizens who are willing to stand up for their rights and defend them even when they're being denied. And to kind of mirror the learned hand quote that Nico ended on, there's a very good one by George Orwell as well. It says, if large numbers of people are interested in freedom of speech, there will be freedom of speech, even if the law forbids it. But if public opinion is sluggish, inconvenient minorities will be persecuted even if laws exist to protect them. So I think that points to the main issue here. The prior thing that we have to confront is developing that firm culture of freedom. The appetite is there, I think. I thought it was striking the way many people responded to those clampdowns in the summer. People were really, even though they had no truck with the kind of opinions that were being expressed on social media and leading to people to be arrested, a lot more people than even I was expecting recognised that this was a huge problem for freedom of speech and for civil liberties. But I think the point now is to channel that into something that can push back against the censorship that we have and secure it for the long term as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.